Joining us is our KTAR News legal expert, Barry Markson. We asked Barry to be on with us because the Attorney General, Kris, is joining the lawsuit over the Trump administration's plan to ban birthright citizenship. He signed an executive order that said, nope, it's not a thing anymore. So Barry, feels like this is already settled constitutional law here, but as we know, the Supreme Court has unsettled some constitutional law in the not-so-distant rearview mirror. So what do we make of this one?
Well, look, this is a constitutional issue. It's the 14th Amendment. So, first of all, nobody can just reverse the Constitution with an executive order. It'd be like, guys, if President Biden had issued an executive order saying we no longer had the right to own arms, to own our own guns, and people would say, well, what about the Second Amendment? And Biden said, well, I'm doing this executive order now and changing the Second Amendment, right? Nobody would stand for that. That's basically what this is. I mean, it's a president trying to wipe out the Constitution in 157 years of constitutional law. The Supreme Court has upheld this twice and saying that if you're born on United States soil, you are a United States citizen. So it would be some pretty major precedential changes from the Supreme Court to change that here. I'll also point out that there's a federal law in place before the 14th Amendment was enacted that says that if you're born on U.S. soil, you are a U.S. citizen. So they'd have to, even if somehow you get rid of the 14th Amendment or say it's been interpreted wrong all this time, that law still exists. So I don't necessarily see this going anywhere, but as you pointed out, Kris, that's not to say with this current Supreme Court that it couldn't happen. What you have now are two separate lawsuits, one filed in the District 1, which is in Massachusetts, which is pretty much all Democratic judges there, and then a second one filed by our Attorney General here in Arizona, Kris, and some other Western states filed in the Ninth Circuit, which is also a little more left-leaning, although not as much as it used to be. So we'll see how this plays out, but it very well could end up at the Supreme Court, so nothing really matters until the Supreme Court rules on it.
Our KTAR News legal expert, Barry Markson, joining us. Barry, you mentioned that it could take a lot. This has been upheld twice, but what could or would the process potentially look like to overturn a piece of the 14th Amendment?
Well, I anticipate that the argument will be that there'll be several arguments. One is that the 14th Amendment was written after the Civil War and in response to slavery, and it was to say that people who were brought here as slaves or who were born here to slaves would be considered U.S. citizens, that they wouldn't have to live in the country and not be considered citizens. Obviously, that was not, they did not contemplate a time when we were dealing with what we call illegal immigration. Now, keep in mind, back then, we didn't have legal and non-legal immigration. I mean, it was a much different time when this constitutional amendment was written, as it is with all the constitutional amendments. Times change, but the amendment is interpreted and supposed to be strictly interpreted, especially by a conservative Supreme Court. So they'd have to persuade the court somehow that the language of the 14th Amendment is not as it's been interpreted twice by the Supreme Court previously, and somehow that there's a carve out or a way to say that illegal immigration and people who have their children here after, but not in the country legally, somehow the 14th Amendment wouldn't cover them. I don't know how that would work. It just doesn't seem plausible given the Supreme Court's decisions in the past. The other thing, I'll just throw this out, guys. There's a lot of people here who are U.S. citizens who are in the country already and have been U.S. citizens their whole life because they were born here in Arizona. I'll give you one local example, and I'm not trying to make this as a smart alecky thing, but our own Congressman Abe Hamadeh was born in the United States to parents who were at the time in the country illegally. They had overstayed their visa. They were not in the country legally. Under what President Trump's executive order is saying, Abe Hamadeh is not a citizen of the United States. So again, I'm not trying to make fun of this. I'm just saying there are millions and millions of people in that same position. What do we do with those people? Are they no longer citizens? Do they lose their rights? Do they have to apply for citizenship? What happens? And it's not just, now they can say, well, it's just going forward, but those are questions that would need to be answered as well.
So Barry Markson's our KTAR legal analyst as we talk about President Trump's executive order to ban birthright citizenship, something that is, at least up until now, was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment as interpreted by the Supreme Court. Barry, you mentioned that there were two cases that did uphold that interpretation. But I would also point out then that Roe v. Wade and then further Planned Parenthood v. Casey were two pretty famous rulings by the Supreme Court that upheld the right to an abortion, which this Supreme Court seemed to find a way around that. Will the plaintiffs in this case, the Trump administration, when they go to the Supreme Court and they start arguing that the 14th Amendment is unconstitutional, which is an oxymoron, will they, or at least the interpretation of it, are they going to hang on to there's a clause in the 14th Amendment that talks about the jurisdiction of the United States. Is that where they're going to hang on this? All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Are they going to say that they may have been born here, but they weren't subject to our jurisdiction?
Yeah, I think that's what they're going to try to do. Chris, it's similar in when they, a lot of folks on the right are saying that we are facing an invasion, like it's a military invasion from Mexico or other countries because we have illegal immigration coming here. And the courts have previously determined that is not how we interpret that language. But they're trying to find a different interpretation of language that has already been interpreted by the court. So I think you're right. Again, I don't see how legally they could do that given the precedent. But you're correct, Chris. I mean, we've seen this Supreme Court as it's currently situated. We've seen the Supreme Court ignore precedent and do their own, find their own way to do things. Now, this is different. Roe v. Wade, I will tell you, there had been a long time argument just in the legal community for several decades whether or not the right to privacy is a constitutional right, and that's what Roe v. Wade is based on. And there's nothing in the Constitution that actually grants us a right to privacy. They found a link and created it in essence, and that's why many people have said Roe v. Wade, set aside however you think about abortion, legally was it enforceable constitutionally. That's different here. This is a constitutional amendment. This is not the Supreme Court in the past creating a right. This is a right that is enshrined in the Constitution directly, and now they're trying to parse the language, as you're saying. So I find it difficult to believe that the Supreme Court would go along with this argument, but there's really no downside for Trump here. He gets to tell his folks who think this is real that he's out there doing this and trying to stop what they call anchor babies and other insulting terms like that. But at the same time, if it doesn't go, it's the court system, and Trump tried. And if somehow the U.S. Supreme Court changes and doesn't stick with precedent, it could greatly affect immigration here in the United States.
Sorry about that there, Barry. Have a bunch more for you, and I suspect we'll be talking about this for weeks, months, potentially years coming up down the road. But let's just say all of this does go through, and somebody was determined to have to leave the United States who was born here. Where would they theoretically go?
Yeah, and Chris, and Joe, I do want to point out, I said that as an example, but the law, the executive order, as Trump wrote it, says it's from anybody who's born in the United States past a certain date in 2025. So it's really just
it's a moving forward thing. Okay.
It really is, but I think it's important for us to understand that we have 100 plus years of people who were born in the United States to people who are not in the country legally, and there are millions of people here and are citizens and are active and good citizens of the country, and they were born here in that way. It's easy to demonize everybody, but there's all sorts of folks who have become citizens that way over the course of many, many decades.
But even using your example right there, Barry, let's just say that it does apply to moving forward. But let's say the country that the U.S. wants to send you back to says, no, we're not going to take you. What then?
Well, and that's, it's a great question, Joe. And that's something that I think Trump is going to be facing with a lot of what he wants to do with the immigration, the changes to the immigration policy as a whole. The Remain in Mexico policy, for example, only worked because Mexico agreed to let those people stay in Mexico while their asylum claim was heard in the United States. If Mexico doesn't agree to do that, I don't know what happens now. If other countries don't agree to take people back that Trump wants to deport, if we find illegal immigrants here in the United States and he starts to deport huge numbers of people, and those countries say we're not taking them anymore, it's a real problem because you can't ship them to a different country. If they're from Guatemala and Guatemala says we're not going to let you, if your plane lands here, we're not going to let you land, or we're not going to let you unload these people. Now what happens? So there's a lot of diplomacy that's baked in here. Part of that is, Trump likes to use the leverage the United States has, whether it be tariffs or other things, to force other countries to accept our deportees. But that's going to be an issue as well.
Barry Markson is our KTAR legal expert, and I think we know what the solution is going to be here, and that is that we just need to have a place that we can send people. We'll call it deportation land, previously known as Greenland. So that will be the new plan. If you come here to the United States, if you're born in the United States from foreign parents, you will be sent to Greenland. It's our new exile island.
That's how Australia was started, right?
Well, that was a penal colony, but yeah, same deal.
Barry Markson is our KTAR News legal expert. Barry, thank you so much for your expertise. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching The Kris and Joe Show. Click to see more from Kris and Joe and tap the button in the middle to subscribe to KTAR News.